Hello everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah from Mormons. Today we're going to be doing Isaiah 29, and this is kind of a great opportunity to talk about some of the issues with the Book of Mormon. I'm going to go into more detail about it in a future lecture, but today we're just going to talk about some of the points of contact. This is pretty similar to 2 Nephi 27, but it isn't exactly the same, and there's some interesting things that come up about how exactly Nephi is using Isaiah in the Book of Mormon and other authors, how these people in the Book of Mormon are understanding and using Isaiah. So we see actually the vast majority of the verses in Isaiah 29 used in other parts of the Book of Mormon, scattered throughout the book, sometimes translated exactly the same, sometimes translated a little bit differently, but it's clear that Isaiah 29 is being used throughout the whole Book of Mormon. And so here in 2 Nephi 27, you see some comparison that they're using Isaiah 29, but they are changing it a little bit, it looks like. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, what it might have meant to the people in Isaiah's time, and also implications for the Book of Mormon, that Isaiah may actually have had some understanding that the Book of Mormon was going to come forth, and was probably alluding to that in this chapter, Isaiah 29, but also that he was also talking about other things, as usual, and we have to remember, Isaiah doesn't usually just confront one issue. He usually talks about multiple issues. He's talking about something that his audience is going to understand, but he also is talking about things that a very small part of his audience will also understand. You have to remember, Isaiah is at this point talking to people in Jerusalem, but he's probably also talking to refugees, people from the north. And these people from the north, presumably, had some things that we now have as a part of our Joseph Smith translation, things about Joseph. And some of those things about Joseph that we have as part of the Joseph Smith translation specifically point to Joseph Smith. So it's very, very likely that Isaiah, part of Isaiah's audience anyway, would have understood things about Joseph Smith and the Restoration, and that Isaiah himself would have understood some things about Joseph Smith and the Restoration. And so he alludes to that here. And Nephi and the Book of Mormon authors and redactors, the editors of the Book of Mormon, pick up on that and they run with it. But here, there's also, of course, as usual, another meaning that he's talking about. So we're going to talk about both of those things today. I would be remiss, I have a friend that would be very disappointed if I didn't mention that there's a lot of necromancy in this chapter. Isaiah's brought up necromancy before, but I'm going to bring it up again to remind you of what it is and how he uses it, because it's a little bit different every time. This is similar to some things we've seen earlier in the book of Isaiah, but it is a little bit different. So we're going to talk about that today. Now, of course, before we get into it, we have to understand the connections here. This is pretty strongly connected to 28. There is a little bit of a break here, but he basically says, as we remember, 28, he's condemning these people for their drunkenness, basically, up in Ephraim. But here in 29, he uses the same imagery, but he says, well, but the people down in Jerusalem are worse. They're having the same issues, but they're not drunk. They're having these issues because God is bringing these issues upon them, making them as though they were drunk. That may be something familiar to you from the Book of Mormon. We'll talk about that when we get there. But here, I think it's good for us to just jump right in with Isaiah chapter 29. Woe to Ariel, the city where David dwelt. Add ye year to year, let them kill sacrifices. Yet I will distress Ariel, and there shall be heaviness and sorrow. It shall be unto me as Ariel. And I will camp against thee round about, and I will lay siege against thee with a mount. And I will raise forts against thee, and thou shalt be brought low, and shalt speak out of the ground. And thy speech shall be low out of the dust. And thy voice shall be as of one that hath a familiar spirit, out of the ground, and thy speech shall whisper out of the dust. Moreover, the multitude of thy strangers shall be like small dust, and the multitude of the terrible ones shall be as chaff that passeth away. It shall be at an instant, suddenly. Thou shalt be visited of the Lord of hosts with thunder and with earthquake and great noise, with storm and tempest and the flame of devouring fire. And the multitude of all the nations that fight against Ariel, even all that fight against her and her munition, and that distress her, shall be as a dream of a night vision. Shall be as when a hungry man dreameth, and behold, he eateth, but he awaketh, and his soul is empty. Whereas when a thirsty man dreameth, and behold, he drinketh, but he awaketh, and behold, he is faint, and his soul hath appetite. So shall the multitude of all the nations be that fight against Mount Zion. Now, this is a little bit confusing. Thankfully here, not only do we have the Book of Mormon, but we have the Joseph Smith translation. And the Book of Mormon uses this chapter throughout the book, and so we can't just go to one chapter. Some people might just go to Two Nephi 27, but that doesn't completely work because it's being sort of reinterpreted in 2 Nephi 27. Presumably, that's what it seems like. But the Joseph Smith translation also is a little bit complicated. The Joseph Smith translation, verses 1 through 8, appears to just be pretty standard Joseph Smith translation kind of stuff, Joseph giving us the earliest text. But you have to remember, we talked about this in the past, the Joseph Smith translation is complicated. He doesn't necessarily always give us the earliest text. Sometimes he just corrects the text so that it makes sense. So, what are we looking at here? I think that in verses 1 through 8, we do have the original text, original to Isaiah, but then, as Joseph goes through, he realizes, oh wait, this is just like what we already got in the Book of Mormon. So he goes back to the Book of Mormon and he inserts it here. It makes perfect sense for him to do that. But because then you get the connection very strongly and you understand what's going on, that this definitely alludes to the restoration, and that's great. But you don't get the meaning that probably would have been understood in Isaiah's time. So we're going to talk about both of those things. We're going to talk mostly about its original context today. We're going to talk about the Book of Mormon understanding of it and his allusions to the Book of Mormon a little bit more at a later date. But here, I just wanted to show that, yeah, there's a lot of continuity here. So just remember what we were talking about in 28, and here we are in 29. So, I will here read the Joseph Smith translation to help make more sense of it. So he says, Woe to Ariel, the city where David dwelt, add ye year to year, let them kill sacrifices. Now, Ariel, people have thought about this, but it really, I think, means hearth of God. People have said maybe it means lion of God or something. That doesn't really make sense in the context. He says, Woe to Ariel, hearth of God, the city where David dwelt. David lived in Jerusalem, and he was actually the first one that established the mountain of Jerusalem, the sacred mountain, Mount Moriah, as the place for offering sacrifices. So he says, Add ye year to year, let them kill sacrifices. He's just talking about sacrifices there. And if so, for him to call it the hearth of God, the place where God's food is cooked, that was kind of one of the functions of sacrifice, at least one conception of it, then this makes perfect sense. But in some ways this is mocking. He says, Woe to Ariel, woe to Jerusalem, in other words, specifically the temple area. Add year to year, let them kill sacrifices. Basically, you keep offering sacrifices every year. You just keep doing this. But things are not going to continue to go well for you. You just keep doing this over and over again. And later he talks about that. They've fallen into this pattern. They just keep doing it just for the sake of doing it. He says, that's not really going to work out. Yet I will distress Ariel, and there shall be heaviness and sorrow. For thus hath the Lord said unto me, it's from the Joseph Smith translation, It shall be unto Ariel, that I the Lord will camp against her round about, and will lay siege against her with a mount, and I will raise forts against her. So this is very, very strong language. You can tell why people changed to this. The Joseph Smith translation fixes this to say, the Lord is the one that is going to go up against Jerusalem. Now, presumably, this is a reference to the Assyrians attacking. Talk about this over and over again, but the Assyrians, they come up against Jerusalem, they attack. Jerusalem is just barely saved. So he says, I will distress Ariel, I will distress Jerusalem, and there will be heaviness and sorrow. Everyone's going to be upset and depressed. Because the Assyrians are going to camp against her, lay siege against her, raise these with a mount. So you have to understand what that is. Lay siege against her with a mount. So the Assyrians would come up, they would camp around it. Then they would make this wooden scaffolding of sorts. Then they would put dirt and stones on top of this, basically make this giant mound of dirt. And then they would slowly raise their siege engines up this mound of dirt in order to kind of breach the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And it says, I will raise forts against her. They would also build these little fortifications from which they could attack down into Jerusalem without being injured themselves. This is how they did it with all these cities that we see. Some of these still exist. Some of these siege towers still exist in some form. Go down to Lachish in southern Israel today. Even today you can still see these siege towers. So this is a very, very brutal system of warfare. And so what they would also do, and he's going to allude to this in the next verse, is the people inside the city would go and they would try to kind of dig under what the Assyrians on the outside were creating as a way of tearing it down. So if they were using a wood superstructure or a wood scaffolding on the inside to support everything, which they sometimes did, people would go in and light that stuff on fire. Or if they were just using stones and rocks, the people would burrow under into the dirt to try to tear down these mounds that people are doing. That was the original function of sappers. Assyrian sappers were some of the best in the world. Sappers today use explosives, but these guys back in the day were the ones that did the tunneling. It says, and she shall be brought down, and shall speak out of the ground. Now, who is this? This is presumably Jerusalem, probably being brought down as far as humbling is concerned. They're being humbled by this experience. But also, literally, many of her inhabitants are being brought down. Remember, they're doing counter-tunneling right now. So they're literally in the dirt doing counter-tunneling. It says, against the Assyrian infrastructure. She shall be brought down and shall speak out of the ground. And her speech shall be low out of the dust. And her voice shall be as of one that hath a familiar spirit out of the ground. And her speech shall whisper out of the dust. Now remember, back in the day, many people used to do necromancy. Necromancy is this system where presumably you dig a hole in the ground and you have somebody who stands outside the hole, a necromancer, somebody who knows how to do this stuff, and they call down into the hole and they call for one of the spirits of the underworld to come talk to them. Now this is all, generally speaking, this is sort of charlatanry, right? People pretending to do this, although it's possible that some people were actually able to do weird things like this, but probably, some satanic stuff involved here. I've seen enough weird things in my life not to write stuff off like this. But that's really what necromancy is, this idea that people can dig holes in the ground, and if they have the gift, they can call into the hole in the ground, and they can bring a spirit up to come and talk to them, to give them privileged information that only people in the underworld would know. Now remember, we've just been talking about this, these people making this agreement with death and hell. And so when he's talking about it here, he's continuing that motif. So 28 and 29 are pretty strongly connected. We'll even see allusions to things like the Samuel story, although it's after Samuel's dead. We'll get to that later on. But we're even still seeing allusions to the Samuel narrative here in this story as well. So this is actually a very apt image, because these people are literally under the dirt digging against the Assyrian mounds that are being thrown up. And so their voice is literally coming out of the ground. People are literally hearing them talking under the ground. But here, it's kind of mocking this. These guys have been trying to use necromancy to figure things out and to make things work against the Assyrians. But Isaiah says, no, this is going to be the exact opposite. Instead of you being on the outside trying to call for people in the ground to come out and help you, you guys yourselves will be in the ground, like these supposed spirits. And you guys will whisper out of the ground. You'll mutter out of the ground, because you're going to have to talk to each other, obviously, to coordinate things when you're tearing down these fortifications of the Assyrians. So, moreover, the multitude of her strangers shall be like small dust. Once again, we see dust. And you can imagine these people are horribly covered in dust trying to do this work in these tunnels. Moreover, the multitude of her strangers shall be like small dust, and the multitude of the terrible one shall be as chaff that passeth away. Yea, it shall be at an instant suddenly. So, all this time, they've been trying to get help from their necromancers. It hasn't worked. So they themselves are now in the ground, whispering out of the dust, the kind of the opposite thing. But then, the multitude of her strangers shall be like small dust. Suddenly, the Assyrians, the strangers, the multitude of strangers that are surrounding Jerusalem, they'll become like small dust. It's as though they've blown away. The multitude of terrible ones shall be as chaff that passeth away. That's how you get rid of chaff, as you blow it away. You have the chaff that's attached to the wheat, and you throw the wheat up in the air in a windy place, and the chaff then blows away. This is probably hearkening back to what Jerusalem actually used to be. The temple area used to be just a winnowing area. It used to be the place where you would separate the wheat from the chaff. The little straw that's attached to the chaff, you just throw it up in the air right there where it's windy, and it blows everything away. And the grain that's heavy falls back down to the ground. And so just as that used to happen, that's what's going to happen to these bad guys, the Assyrians, surrounding Jerusalem. They're just going to disappear like chaff blown away on the wind. For they shall be visited of the Lord of hosts with thunder and earthquake and great noise, with storm and tempest and the flame of devouring fire. Now this is interesting. All that we get in the story of the Assyrians is the disease that comes, right? The angel of the Lord comes out, kills 185,000 of them in one night, and they all run home, basically. But here, you get the impression that there might have been more to it than that. The historical part of the book of Isaiah appears to have been written much later, and it's probably simplified. It's probably not quite in chronological order either. But this may be a little bit more of a well-depicted representation of what happened, that these people are doing this stuff, that the Assyrians did actually at least start to make the attempt, and the people of Jerusalem were frantically trying to fix things. But then God may not have only attacked them with the plague, which also appears to have spread in Jerusalem as well. We'll talk about that later too. But he says they're visited of the Lord of hosts with thunder, earthquake, and great noise, with storm and tempest and the flame of devouring fire. It could be that he literally brought in a giant thunderstorm upon them, and that then they left. It's possible. It might just be symbolic. But if you had a giant thunderstorm, that might be what you would see. So it's being described here in verse 6. So it's possible that there was more to it than just what we have in the very sort of skin and bones history that we get in Isaiah, the small section of Isaiah that covers the history, and also the Book of Kings. And the multitude of all the nations that fight against Ariel, even all that fight against her and her munition, her troops really, I'd probably translate that, and that distress her shall be as a dream of a night vision. So everybody that's attacking Jerusalem and her troops will be like this dream of a night vision. It shall be unto them even as a hungry man who dreameth, and behold, he eateth, he awaketh, and his soul is empty. I would probably say his throat is empty. That's one translation we now know for the word sometimes translated soul in Hebrew is throat. So you're hungry, you fall asleep, you dream that you eat, and then you wake up and you're still hungry. I imagine many of us have had that experience. Now you're thirsty when you go to bed. You dream that you get something to drink in your sleep, and you wake up and you're still thirsty. And it says his soul hath appetite, presumably. Literally, your throat is dry in this case. Yea, even so shall the multitude of all the nations be that fight against Zion. They have these grand dreams. They think they're going to do all these things. They planned everything out. They've said exactly what they're going to do, and then suddenly they disappear. And I think that's exactly really what happens here. So that's what we got from the Joseph Smith translation. Subtly different and actually makes a lot more sense. Now, the Book of Mormon continues, but once again, the Book of Mormon appears to have a lot of commentary by Nephi, so we have to kind of go it alone for a little while. I will bring in the Book of Mormon stuff later, but for today, we're just going to have to slog through some of the rest of it by ourselves. But it was nice to have this little section of the Joseph Smith translation for sure. And we can use the Book of Mormon to help us here, once again, as we always do. This is even better, because, as I said, we know this is original because it's scattered throughout the Book of Mormon. And we have some good possible interpretation of it because so much of it appears in the Book of Mormon. So, here he says, "Stay yourselves and wonder, cry ye out and cry. They are drunken but not with wine, they stagger but not with strong drink. For the Lord hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and hath closed your eyes, the prophets and your rulers, the seers hath he covered. And the vision of all is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I cannot, for it is sealed. And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I am not learned. Now here, he says, this is a little bit confusing, and this is one occasion where I think that what we get in the Book of Mormon is not Nephi's interpretation. I think it's probably pretty original to it. So we're just going to go there really quickly and see what it has to say, because it is actually probably pretty useful here. So it says, For behold, all ye that doeth iniquity, stay yourselves and wonder, for ye shall cry out and cry. Yea, you shall be drunken, but not with wine. You shall stagger, but not with strong drink. So, here once again, remember what he was talking about in the last chapter? About these priests up in Ephraim getting drunk all the time and doing everything wrong. The prophets and seers are just getting drunk and constantly not doing everything the way they're supposed to do. Well, here he says, you workers of iniquity in Jerusalem, you guys are going to, it says, stay yourselves and wonder. Basically is going to be, you're going to be so amazed and brought to silence. You're going to cry out and be totally amazed, or actually cry out and be blind. He alludes to that later. Cry out and be blind. Yea, you shall be drunken, but not with wine. You shall stagger, but not with strong drink. So he says, I am going to be the one that is going to be doing these things to you. You're going to feel my wrath against you. It's not going to be wine that's going to make you stumble like the priests up in northern Israel. It's going to be me. So he says, you that do wickedly, this is going to happen to you. It's going to be like you're drunk, but it's not going to be from wine. The Lord hath poured out upon you, just as one might pour someone else wine, little pun there, the spirit of deep sleep, and hath closed your eyes. The prophets and your rulers, the seers hath he covered. Those guys up in the north are not getting it because they're drunk. You guys down south, you guys aren't drunk, but you guys are doing everything wrong, and so I'm making it like you're drunk. Now, does this sound familiar to anybody? Maybe from the Book of Mormon? Maybe there's an occasion that you can recall where there's a group of people who escape from bondage by getting their captors drunk, and shortly thereafter there's another group that escapes from bondage, not by getting their captors drunk, but because God brings upon them the spirit of deep sleep. Is this familiar to you? I hope so. Is that an allusion to this chapter in the Book of Mormon? Presumably it is. Like I said, this chapter continuously shows up in the Book of Mormon. We can't write off the possibility that when they were telling that story, they had this chapter in mind. Remember, the Book of Mormon constantly is trying to tell these stories in as artful a way as possible. And so for them to use Isaiah as a vehicle through which to tell the story is not outside the realm of possibility. We today don't really do that. We like to kind of give just the facts, but that would have been totally ridiculous to people in the ancient world. They liked good literature. They liked to have stories that were basically factually accurate, But there are all kinds of ways to tell a true story. And if people want to slightly model the story after something out of Isaiah, why not? So much the better. And I think that is what we're seeing there in that part of the Book of Mormon. So, we'll continue here. So in other words, these people are being made as though they're drunk, even though clearly they are not. He says, just like those people up in the north were drunk and their prophets and seers were kaput because of that, he says, I'm the one making it so the prophets and seers are worthless now. Now, obviously these are false prophets. Isaiah clearly is doing just fine. It's the false prophets that are no longer able to function. And the vision of all vision, is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I cannot, for it is sealed. And the book is delivered to him that's not learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I am not learned. Now, we know one fantastic interpretation of this. It comes from the Book of Mormon, and this is literally what happens when the Book of Mormon is translated. We all know the story, Professor Anton. Martin Harris goes in. He has a copy of some things written out of the plates. He shows it to this Professor Anton. Professor Anton says, oh yeah, this is great. This is real Egyptian. I'd like to translate. Bring me the book and I'll translate it. And he says, well, I can't bring it because it's sealed. And what does he say? I cannot read a sealed book. What's hilarious about that is that Professor Anton may actually have had this in mind and specifically have been quoting it, because most of these guys were Old Testament scholars and then branched off into other things like Egyptian. So it's possible that he literally was quoting this. So kind of fantastic, not realizing that he was sort of accidentally fulfilling prophecy in the process. But there's another interpretation of this. Once again, not everybody is going to even know about the restoration in Isaiah's time. You have to remember this. So, there's another interpretation for the kind of people that are just doing their thing in Jerusalem that aren't really up on things. So, it says, the vision of all vision, is become to you as the words of a book that is sealed. So, book is maybe not a great translation here. Record is probably more generic, because back then they didn't have books as we think of them. Books as we think of them today are codices. They're these things with covers and pages and everything. Back in the day, books, when you often see book in the Old Testament, it's usually just a scroll. It's a big old long piece of paper wrapped around a stick. And we now know what they used to do is they'd wrap the paper, or papyrus or whatever, usually parchment, honestly, parchment or papyrus, around this stick. Then you wrap it up tightly with string, and then you put a piece of clay on the string, and you take the ring. You have a big old ring on your finger that's basically like your signature. It has a special carving in it that's unique to you. You punch it into the clay, and then boom, your scroll is sealed up. So nobody can open it, because you have to understand, if I want to talk to the guy in five towns over from me, if I don't want to go visit him, what I do is I seal one of these things with my own seal. I give it to my messenger. He takes it over to the guy in 5 towns over. This guy then breaks the seal and reads it. Now, if when the message reaches him the seal is broken, he knows that this guy has the messenger guy has probably opened it and tampered with the message somehow. Especially when financial transactions, that was incredibly common. So, what you do is you seal it up with this special seal, a special clay seal with your ring stamped on it, so that when the guy sees it, he sees the seal that only you have, so you have to have sealed it. Once it makes it to him, if it's still sealed, he knows that it hasn't been tampered with and that the information is correct. So, with that in mind, let's look at this. So if you brought it to somebody that is learned, that knows how to read, and you say, read this, I pray thee, he would say, well, I can't. The book is sealed up. So that's the kind of thing that might happen. If you wanted it to be read, you might bring it to a literate guy, but the literate guy would probably know all the conventions of this process, and he would say, no, you can't just sit here and open a sealed book. You have to, it has to make it to the destination, and the person that's supposed to open it will open it and read it. Okay? So he would say, no, I can't read it, it's sealed. But if some unlearned person got a hold of it, he might have no qualms with opening the book because he may have no idea about the process of taking and receiving sealed messages. So he might break the seal, look at it and say, well, I broke the seal, but I have no idea what it says, right? And that's what he's talking about here, that those that are not learned, as it were, just these people there in Jerusalem, these people have been trying to do all these great and grand things, apparently via necromancy, and all these false prophets have been trying to figure all these things out. But God says he's going to cover them. He's going to keep them from seeing anything. Remember, that's where seer comes from, someone who sees. So he's going to keep them from seeing anything. All these false prophets are going to be totally kaput. And so they're going to say, well, I can't read this. I'm sorry. The information is no longer available to me. But Isaiah, somebody who is, quote, learned, who understands the conventions of messages, he has the integrity that he's not going to open the sealed book. So in other words, this information is, at this time, is going to pass from them, and there's going to be no way for them to access this information about the future. And really, information from God at all. The idea of the prophet as messenger makes perfect sense here. With these sealed books, God kind of bringing this message and giving it to mankind, well, suddenly no one is going to be able to read out this message, as it were, to the people. And so that's the idea here. And the Book of Mormon guys, obviously, this works so well with the Book of Mormon. They're going to pick this up and run with it. And Isaiah appears actually to be alluding specifically to the Book of Mormon in this chapter. We'll get there in just a little bit. But this is one interpretation, and this is probably how people would have understood it at the time. They would have known about this message-sending system, and they would have gone, there is no longer any way of sending messages between God and man, because the run-of-the-mill people, the false prophets, can't even do false prophecy anymore. God's going to keep them from doing it. But the good prophets have the integrity not to open the message. Remember, Isaiah is not saying everything he knows at this point. He's been told in chapter 6 not to. So, he's saying, I can't open it. It's sealed. It's reserved for another time. So these people are going to not have complete prophecy during this period. Wherefore, in 13, wherefore the Lord said, forasmuch as this people draw near to me with their mouth and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. Now, this is also used in the Book of Mormon. It's not translated the same way. But remember the scene with the Rameumptom? This is used in that scene. Shortly after the people get down from the Rameumptom, we have all the missionaries there. They're saying their own prayer. They pray something using a slightly different translation of this phrase. So once again, we know that this chapter is probably basically like this because it's been scattered throughout the Book of Mormon. Once again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But he says, these people draw near to me with their mouth, and with their lips do honor me. They pay lip service to God. They say that they love God, but their heart is far from him. They only fear God because they've been commanded by men to do so. It's just a convention. Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid. Woe unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord, and their works are in the dark, and they say, who seeth us, and who knoweth us? Now this is very interesting. Once again, there's a reason why I think Isaiah is specifically alluding to Joseph Smith, and it comes in this verse. Now, the Book of Mormon definitely sees it that way. That's obviously a very good indication Isaiah may have also been thinking about Joseph Smith. But once again, Isaiah tends to just allude to these things. We know that he knows about it because of things in the Joseph Smith translation, but he tends not to specifically talk about it super directly because, once again, he's trying to talk to multiple audiences at once here. So, this is a great example of that in this verse. Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people. That's fine, but it can also be read, because of the word proceed to do, it can be read a little bit differently. It can be read proceed to do. It can also be read as do again, but it can also be read as a name. Therefore, behold, I, Joseph, will do a work among this people, a marvelous work and a wonder. Now, the grammar is a little funny either way. The phrase is strange, and it's possible the phrase is meant to be intentionally ambiguous so that you can read it both ways. Most of his audience wouldn't have really thought much of it, just Isaiah kind of being funny. But for those of us, for some of his audience, they would have gone, oh, Joseph. That Joseph talked about in what is today the Joseph Smith translation, but what at the time was at the end of Genesis. And they would have gone, oh, Joseph. Joseph is going to do these things. Suddenly, it all starts to come together. So once again, the classic Isaiah pun. We're going to see a lot more of these as we continue. This is just the quintessential Isaiah making these puns as he kind of talks about more than one thing at a time. By the way, I owe that insight to a friend of mine named Carly that I worked with for many years. She pointed that out to me. So then he says, I'm going to work a marvelous work and a wonder. Now, for us, we would say, this is Joseph Smith, that's the Book of Mormon, right? But at the time, it simply would have been enough that the wisdom of wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their understanding ones, it says prudent in the King James, but understanding ones shall be hid. Woe to them that seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord, and their works are in the dark, and they say, who seeth us, and who knoweth us? So, basically, the marvelous work is that even their most wise and understanding men suddenly are at a loss. Suddenly they don't know what to do. Suddenly they don't understand anymore. That fits in with the theme of everything we've just been talking about. That nobody can understand anything, the learned or the unlearned. Nobody can figure out what's going on. And then we return to the necromancy theme. Woe unto them that seek in the deep. It says, seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord. Once again, this is also alluded to in the Book of Mormon pretty strongly. In other parts of the Book of Mormon, besides 2 Nephi 27. But he says, woe unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord. And the implication is to seek in the deep, like they're underground again. The image brought up earlier with necromancy. To hide their counsel, what they're saying from the Lord, and their works are in the dark. Their doings are in the dark. And they say, who seeth us, and who knoweth us? So this is once again the people going into the ground as though they were the spirits in the underworld, taking part in necromancy. This also ties back into chapter 28, their covenant with hell that they've made, and their agreement with Mot, the god of death. And so then God says, if you guys are going to be the ones in the ground, like the ones, usually those are the spirits that get called out of the ground with necromancy, if you guys are going to try to hide your decisions and what you guys are saying from me as you're in the ground, sort of hiding from me, and thinking that I don't see you, well, you guys are turning everything upside down. That's probably a better translation of 16. You guys are turning everything upside down. Think about it. Is the potter as the potter's clay? Does the work say of him that made it, he made me not? Or does the thing framed say of him that framed it, he had no understanding? So in other words, I'm the one that actually reveals what's going on. You can't hide from me. You guys are turning everything upside down because you guys are thinking you're manipulating events. Potters cast pots. The pot does not cast the potter. God, in other words, says, I'm the one doing this. Does the one that is made say, oh, he didn't make me? The thing built say of the builder, oh yeah, he didn't know what he was doing? No, I'm the one in control. You guys think you're in control, but I'm the one in control. That's what God is saying to these people. Is it not yet a very little while, and Lebanon shall be turned into a fruitful field, and the fruitful field shall be esteemed as a forest? Now, you have to get some background here. Lebanon is up north. We've talked about these guys before. The Phoenicians, we talked about them. They live in that area, that Lebanon area. And the reason they lived up there is they had these massively tall cedar trees that they could build ships out of. Because cedar is great because it doesn't really rot that much, and it smells good. has really tall trees that you can use to turn into ships. So this Lebanon area has these great trees, and it was known for its trees. He says, is it not a very little while, and Lebanon shall be turned into a field? It is a fruitful field, but still it's a field. It's going to be completely, all the trees are going to be cut down. And even that fruitful field, people are going to think that it's a forest because it's so much better than everything else. Okay, that's the implication here. So in that day, when everything is decimated, shall the deaf hear the words of the book, and the eyes of the blind shall see out of obscurity and out of darkness. So this is all about eschatological reversal. I'm going to continue and then come back to this, but remember, this is the reversal at the last days. The meek shall also increase their joy in the Lord, and the poor among men shall rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. For the terrible one is brought to naught, and the scorners consumed, and all that watch for iniquity are cut off. That make a man an offender for a word, and lay a snare for him that reproveth in the gate, and turn aside the just for a thing of naught. Therefore thus saith the Lord, who redeemed Abraham concerning the house of Jacob, Jacob shall not now be ashamed, neither shall his face now wax pale. But when he seeth his children, the work of mine hands in the midst of him, they shall sanctify my name, and sanctify the Holy One of Jacob, and shall fear the God of Israel. They also that erred in spirit shall come to understanding, and they that murmured shall learn doctrine. Now this here is not just eschatological reversal at the end of the world, but this is reversal just in what's going to happen with the Assyrians. He said, you guys think you're so smart? Well, you guys that think you're so smart are not going to understand anything. And the deaf will hear the words of the book. The eyes of the blind will see out of obscurity and out of darkness. So the old order that has existed is no longer going to exist. God is going to bring the low high, and presumably bring the high low. The meek also shall increase their joy in the Lord, and the poor among men shall rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. The low will increase their joy in the Lord, and the poor will rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. Now, the deaf hearing and the eyes of the blind seeing. This can just be seen as sort of an exaggeration of the reversal that's going to happen when the Assyrians come in. And that's, I think, an apt understanding. But also, literally, there is going to be a time that Isaiah is talking about in the future when, literally, Jesus comes and the deaf hear and the blind see, right? So we see both of those things at play here, I think. That he's talking is kind of in an exaggerated way about the reversal that's going to happen, but I think he may also be at least alluding to the Savior who is to bring about that reversal. If we believe in the book of Moses, then Isaiah has some grasp of Jesus and what he's going to do when he comes. So for him to talk about that here would not be such a crazy thing. So he says, the terrible one is brought to naught. Those that are abusing the poor and the meek are brought to naught, and the scorner is consumed, and all that watch for iniquity are cut off. Those that watch for iniquity, want iniquity to happen, presumably, are cut off. That make a man an offender for a word. That's a little bit difficult, but in other words, those that depict a man as being an offender by what they say. Those that swear falsely, presumably, against the poor and against others. And lay a snare for him that reproveth in the gate. So kind of trapping people that are trying to correct them. And turn aside the just for a thing of naught. They turn in the just like it's not a big deal. These people that are persecuting the poor and the just and those that try to bring justice, these people are going to be eliminated. Which, of course, Once again, that does happen when the Assyrians come to town. We have to remember that a lot of these people are deported. A lot of the rich are deported. The poor stick around because they're just going to sit around and grow stuff anyway. So a lot of the poor do stick around, but the rich are deported. So literally, this is going to be exactly what happens. Therefore, thus saith the Lord who redeemed Abraham concerning the house of Jacob, Jacob shall not now be ashamed, neither shall his face now wax pale. Finally, Jacob can be proud of his posterity because of what is about to happen. For when he seeth his children the work of mine hands in the midst of him, they shall sanctify my name, and sanctify the Holy One of Jacob, and shall fear the God of Israel. In other words, they will finally worship the Lord again. After all this time wandering off the path, he's going to bring them back onto the path. They also that erred, I guess is how you pronounce that. They that erred in spirit, that didn't really get it, shall finally understand. They'll come to understanding. And they that murmured, those that spoke against it, shall learn doctrine. They'll finally understand the truth. So that is just one very basic understanding of this chapter. The Book of Mormon, guys, love this chapter, and in a future lecture I'm going to talk about this chapter and a bunch of other occurrences of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon and how it's used. But this, I think, is just such a beautiful, beautiful idea that someday the social order that at times can feel so oppressive is going to come tumbling down. And for a lot of us, that's actually kind of unsettling, because many of us are on the sort of upper end of this social order. We would be the rich that would be taken away and deported, at least comparatively rich. People that would have been taken away and deported back in the day. We have enough to eat. We never have to worry about starvation. We are well educated, many of us. And so this, I think, should be a little bit of a warning to us that we should not think that we can do everything ourselves. We need to rely on God. These people keep trying to do this necromancy stuff, and God just continuously is making fun of them about it and telling them, yeah, this is just not going to work. The image of them covered in dust, mumbling under the ground like they themselves are the spirits in the underworld, is just, I think, a fantastic image. And it shows the totally ridiculous nature of what these people were doing. They were trying to do all this stuff themselves, trying to do everything their own way and forget about God in their lives. But God says, I'm absolutely a part of your life. I'm the one that made you. Are you guys going to sit here and pretend that I didn't create you, that I didn't create you and your nation, for that matter? When everything goes crazy, when even just a field is viewed as a forest because everything is so desolate, everything is going to be turned upside down. So where do you want to be? Do you want to be one of the abusive rich that is brought low? Or do you want to be one of those that supports the poor and survives? And I think that question is just as relevant today as it's ever been. Do we want to be one of those that supports the poor and is preserved at the last days, as it were? Or at our last days during the judgment? Or do we revel in our money and never support the poor and don't worry about all the problems that we see in our country and just let things happen? And when the judgment happens, what do you think God is going to say? He's going to say, good job for not taking care of the poor? No, he's going to say, why didn't you visit those that were in prison? Why didn't you visit those that were sick? Why didn't you, in today's society, why didn't you tutor those kids who didn't have access to good education? Why didn't you volunteer at the food bank? Why didn't you talk to those people that feel like they're outcasts in whatever circumstances you might encounter them? I think that what Isaiah is saying to people in his time is just as relevant as it's ever been. Sometimes uncomfortably relevant, because we know exactly what he's talking about, because we experience it. So I would just say that we should think about that. When we read these things, we should let it sink in. And we should remember that even though things may not be as dire, we aren't just about to get invaded by the Assyrians, it does make sense for us to support the poor. It does make sense for us to befriend the friendless. And God will bless us if we do. And He will curse us if we don't. So anyway, that's chapter 29. We will be doing chapter 30 for a little bit later, and we'll be going through some more of these issues. This is pretty closely connected to 29 as he continues to talk about some of these things. So thanks very much for being with me today, and we will see you guys next time.